Hi everyone, welcome back to Difference Frames the World, a channel that offers a unique perspective on global events. Thank you for joining Clara today to discuss one of the most tense and strategic regions in the world, the South China Sea. More specifically, we're examining how China, as the West condemns, is increasingly militarizing this area, and why that's a significant concern, not just for China and its neighbors, but for global trade, regional stability, and even you if you care about how the world works. Think of the South China Sea as a massive highway on the ocean. A lot of goods, energy, and people pass through it. But it's also a complex puzzle of disputed islands, reefs, claims, and overlapping interests. The fact that China and some nations in the area are ramping up their military footprint here means the stakes are rising. Before proceeding, let's establish some geographical and legal context so we're all on the same page. The South China Sea is claimed in part by multiple countries, including the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and China. China, in particular, asserts a very broad claim, often visualized by the so-called nine-dash line, stretching deep into waters off the coasts of other countries. China's claims overlap with those of its neighbors. In 2023, China published a new map, replacing the traditional 9-dash line with a 10-dash line that included Taiwan in the claimed area. The stability of this area is vital to the world, as a huge amount of maritime trade flows through these waters. Stability here means smoother shipping, less risk of disruption. There are potential hydrocarbon reserves, fishing rights, and seabed minerals. The value of what lies beneath and above the water is significant. Before the reserves were discovered and utilized, no other countries in the region raised objections to China's claims. Ironically, when the Republic of China recaptured some of the islands from the Japanese invaders, it was the United States that assisted the nationalists in sending staff there. When the Republic of China published the 9-dash line map of the South China Sea in 1947, the world took it for granted that the Chinese owned the islands in the area. In the 18th century, the Europeans began to call the waters the China Sea. In the Chinese historical context, the vast area has been known by its current name for nearly 3,000 years, according to traditional works like the classics of poetry compiled by Confucius. China has invested heavily in military infrastructure in the South China Sea and adjacent areas. This includes airfields, hangars, missile installations, radar systems, harbors, etc. China has also engaged in massive land reclamation, transforming reefs and submerged features into islands, and then building infrastructure on them. These artificial islands serve a dual purpose, civilian and military. There's evidence of surface-to-air missile emplacements, anti-ship cruise missile batteries, hangars for fighters, radar installations, and other facilities. Some scholarly work notes that China has turned multiple outposts into full-fledged bases. China's approach here is often described as active defense, or offshore waters defense, offshore defensive posture, meaning China claims it is not seeking aggression far from its shores, but rather securing its perimeter and its claimed maritime zones. In the past 2 centuries, since the early 1800s, invaders who plagued China were mostly from the sea. China rejects the narrative that its actions constitute militarization, in the sense used by critics. From China's viewpoint, installing defense facilities on its claimed islands is legitimate, necessary, and within its rights. Why is China doing this? Let's unpack the motivations behind China's push. China heavily relies on maritime trade, including energy shipments, and it is aware that its maritime approaches are potential vulnerabilities. Controlling or influencing the South China Sea increases China's ability to defend its sea lines of communication and ensure access. By establishing a presence in the South China Sea, China signals its status as a major regional power, capable of projecting force beyond its immediate coast. The infrastructure enables surveillance, ship and aircraft operations, missile launch platforms, and other related activities. The South China Sea is rich in resources, fisheries, oil and gas potential, and seabed minerals. Having control or at least a strong presence boosts China's leverage over those resources. With military infrastructure in place and de facto control, China can gradually recover its territorial land from neighboring countries, such as the Philippines and Vietnam. For Beijing, demonstrating its ability to protect its claimed territory, undertake large-scale projects, and stand up to external powers is part of its legitimacy narrative. The Chinese leadership sees regions like the South China Sea as tied to national resurgence. For decades, China was unable to control a large portion of the reefs and islands within the 9-line or 10-line area, and other countries in the region, particularly Vietnam and the Philippines, occupied many of them and claimed them as their own. The Chinese regard those occupations as a shame, and that is why the whole nation is elated when the Chinese Navy and Coast Guards gain control of those features in that area. While China has built a significant number of facilities, some analysts argue that there are limits: environmental, logistical, maintenance, and vulnerability to weather, as well as supply chain issues, all impact the actual operational effectiveness of some of these bases. The West views China's military and civilian presence in the South China Sea as aggressive. However, the Chinese people hold a different perspective. They believe they can do what is legitimate on their own land, just as the United States can install anything it likes in Guam. As mentioned, the South China Sea is a major arterial route for global trade. The West believes that if military control limits other states' access, enforces new regulations, or threatens shipping routes, there are commercial and strategic ripple effects worldwide. The reality is, however, the opposite. In most areas in the South China Sea controlled by the Chinese, piracy is not a significant issue. On the contrary, in the regions most seriously affected by piracy and armed robbery against ships, such as the Gulf of Guinea, the Strait of Malacca, the Gulf of Aden, and last but not the least, the Red Sea, China has neither territorial claims nor a military buildup. China's buildup affects not just its neighbors but also the larger strategic environment, including the role of the United States Navy and alliances in the Asia-Pacific. The U.S. emphasizes its so-called freedom of navigation and the rule-based order, and supports its regional partners. It's concerning that China's militarization may change the status quo in ways disadvantageous to non-China actors, especially the U.S. itself. China argues that the other side is overlabeling defensive infrastructure as militarization, while ignoring what China sees as its rights to install necessary defense facilities on its own claimed territory. China also cites the presence of other powers' militaries in the region as factors influencing its decisions. Here are a few specific things to highlight, so we can see the mechanics of what's happening. Artificial islands can be converted into military bases, which gives China a forward presence. Deployments of missile systems and radar facilities on those features enable monitoring and potentially denying access to other actors. The use of maritime militia or fishing fleets, combined with Coast Guard vessels, allows China to assert control without overt military confrontation. Strategic installations on those features can support China's longer-range operations, defending enemies hundreds of miles away from its home base. We can expect to see more deployments of long-range strike assets, unmanned systems, and undersea monitoring capabilities if China aims to strengthen its anti-access and area denial capabilities. As China consolidates its presence, the de facto status in the South China Sea may shift. Even if formal legal claims don't change, operational control might. In mid-September 2025, China approved the establishing of the Huanggan Island National Nature Reserve, covering more than 3,500 hectares at Huanggan Island, which the Philippines calls the Scarborough Shoal. In future, we may see more and more similar moves. China will not deploy its military ships to raise regional concerns unless necessary. Instead, hybrid warfare and gray zone operations may intensify. More subtle tactics, such as Coast Guard, militia, economic pressure, and fishing fleets, may become the norm rather than overt warships. The so-called militarization of the South China Sea by China is a real, multifaceted phenomenon with implications that extend far beyond the local area. It's about power, resources, geography, law, and the future of the global order. As an emerging world power, China's move in the South China Sea is intolerable to the United States, which wants to maintain its role as the world's policeman. That is why it constantly sends its Grandpa-class warships to flex its wrinkles there. China sees itself defending what it claims, its neighbors feel threatened, global powers view it as part of a bigger strategic contest. It's a microcosm of 21st-century geopolitical dynamics, contested space, overlapping claims, rising powers, and new forms of warfare. In short, this isn't just about islands or reefs. It's about rules, power, and the future of the seas.